When police arrived at the Springfield home, they found 3 purses, 3 cars, and 3 women gone. There were no signs of a break-in, no obvious struggle, and that may have been the most important clue in the entire case. More than 30 years later, investigators still don't know what happened to Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall. On June 6, 1992, Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall celebrated their high school graduation. Friends later recalled that the evening felt ordinary. The 2 young women moved between graduation parties and eventually returned to Springfield. Sometime after 2 a.m., they arrived at Cheryl Levitt's home. It was the last confirmed sighting of Susie and Stacy. By the next morning, friends became concerned when they could not reach the women. When people arrived at the house, they noticed that all 3 cars were still there. Inside, they found purses, cigarettes, clothing, and other personal belongings. Nothing suggested that the women had planned to leave for an extended period. Yet the house was empty. Investigators searched for signs of forced entry. They found no clear evidence that someone had broken into the home. That absence created one of the central mysteries of the case. If an intruder had entered by force, investigators expected to see damage. Instead, the evidence suggested that whoever came to the house may have been allowed inside. One of the earliest details investigators examined was a broken porch light outside the home. Friends who entered the house later reported cleaning up the broken glass before realizing it might be evidence. That decision may have unintentionally altered part of the scene before police could document it. Investigators could not determine with certainty whether the light had been broken during the disappearance or at another time. Another detail that drew attention was a series of strange phone calls received at the house. People who were inside the home after the disappearance reportedly answered several calls that became increasingly disturbing. The exact content of those calls has been reported differently over the years, so investigators have been cautious about drawing firm conclusions from them. What is confirmed is that the calls added to the growing sense that something unusual had happened inside the home. By reconstructing the timeline, detectives narrowed the disappearance window to only a few hours. The women were believed to have arrived home sometime after 2 a.m. Friends became concerned later that morning when no one answered the phone, and the women failed to appear as expected. That meant whatever happened likely occurred between their arrival home and the time friends began checking on them the next day. For investigators, the central question became this: if 3 women disappeared from the same house in a matter of hours, why was there so little evidence showing how they left? By the time detectives began reconstructing the timeline, they realized the case was far stranger than a typical missing person investigation. The women had arrived home sometime after 2 a.m., and by later that morning, all 3 had vanished without leaving behind any clear explanation. That meant the critical window was only a few hours long. Investigators believed whatever happened occurred between the women's arrival and the time friends began checking on them the next day. The first thing that stood out was the cars. All 3 vehicles were still at the house. If the women had left voluntarily, investigators would normally expect at least one vehicle to be missing. Then there were the purses. All 3 had been left behind. Along with them were cigarettes, clothing, and other personal belongings. These were the kinds of items people usually take with them when they expect to be gone. To detectives, the scene looked less like a planned departure and more like an interruption. Something had caused 3 people to leave the house quickly, yet the house itself showed remarkably little evidence of what that something was. That brought investigators back to the same question: if there was no forced entry, How had whoever was responsible gained access? One possibility was that the door had been opened voluntarily. If that was true, it suggested a very different scenario from a random intruder breaking in. It raised the possibility that the women either recognized the visitor or had some reason to open the door. Investigators also looked at the sequence of events. Susie and Stacy had been seen at graduation celebrations earlier in the evening. Friends later placed them at multiple gatherings before they returned to Cheryl Levitt's home. The route home did not immediately reveal any obvious danger. There were no confirmed reports of a confrontation on the way, and no verified evidence that the women were being followed. That meant the focus returned to the house itself. Detectives began treating the home as the most likely location where the chain of events had started. The broken porch light became important because it was one of the few unusual physical details investigators had. However, they could not determine exactly when it had been damaged, which limited its value as a definitive clue. The phone calls added another layer of uncertainty. People who were inside the house after the disappearance reported receiving several unusual calls, but the exact details of those conversations have been reported inconsistently over the years. For investigators, the challenge was that every clue seemed to raise another question. The cars were there. The purses were there. The personal items were there. But the three women were gone. And the more detectives reconstructed the overnight timeline, the more unusual the disappearance became. As detectives expanded the investigation, they faced an unusual problem. Most missing person cases involve a single victim. This case involved three people disappearing from the same house during the same overnight window. That immediately reduced the likelihood of several common explanations. A voluntary departure by one person is not unusual. Three people leaving together without taking their cars, purses, or personal belongings is far more difficult to explain. Investigators considered whether the women had left willingly with someone they trusted. The absence of forced entry made that possibility impossible to ignore. But that theory created another problem. If the women voluntarily went outside, why were their essential belongings still inside the house? Detectives also examined the possibility of an abduction. Yet there were no obvious signs of a violent struggle, no confirmed eyewitnesses, and no clear physical trail leading away from the home. The more investigators looked at the scene, the more it appeared that whatever happened had occurred quickly and with very little noise. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was that every clue pointed in two directions at once. No forced entry suggested familiarity. Abandoned belongings suggested urgency. The lack of witnesses suggested secrecy. Investigators could not identify a single piece of evidence that clearly explained all three facts at the same time. And that may be the reason the Springfield Three case has remained unsolved for decades. The evidence does not fit neatly into a single theory. Instead, it creates a pattern that is both incomplete and deeply unusual. One reason the Springfield Three case became so difficult is that investigators were not dealing with a single missing person. They were dealing with three separate individuals who disappeared during the same overnight period. In many missing person investigations, detectives can focus on one victim's relationships, movements, and habits. Here, they had to reconstruct the lives and recent activities of three different people at once. Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall had spent the evening attending graduation celebrations. Cheryl Levitt had been at home. Investigators had to determine whether the disappearance was connected to the younger women's activities, the home itself, or something entirely separate. The presence of 3 victims also complicated witness information. A sighting of one person was not enough. Detectives needed to know whether all 3 women had been seen together separately or not at all after returning home. Another challenge was logistics. Moving one person against their will is difficult. Moving 3 people without attracting attention is significantly harder. That fact alone made investigators question whether the women had initially left the house voluntarily. Yet the abandoned cars and purses pointed in the opposite direction. Those items suggested the women did not expect to be gone for long, if they expected to leave at all. Investigators were left with a contradiction. The evidence suggested urgency, but not chaos. Departure, but not preparation. Movement, but almost no visible struggle. And that contradiction is one of the reasons the Springfield Three case remains unlike most missing person investigations. Every major clue seems to support one explanation, while simultaneously creating a new problem for that explanation. More than 3 decades after the disappearance, investigators are still missing one crucial piece of information: what happened during the final hours inside the house. Detectives know the women arrived home. They know the cars remained in the driveway. They know the purses were left behind. What they do not know is what caused all 3 women to leave. Investigators have never publicly identified a definitive suspect. Over the years, various names have been discussed, but none have produced enough evidence to close the case. Another unanswered question is whether the women left the house together. If they did, investigators must explain how 3 people departed with almost no evidence. If they did not, detectives must determine the order in which events unfolded. The lack of a clear timeline after 2 a.m. remains one of the biggest obstacles in the investigation. Without a confirmed sighting, detectives cannot establish exactly when the disappearance occurred. Investigators also continue to face the problem of contradictory clues. No forced entry suggests familiarity. Abandoned belongings suggest urgency. The absence of witnesses suggests secrecy. In many cold cases, detectives eventually identify a pattern that points clearly in one direction. In the Springfield Three investigation, the pattern remains incomplete. And that may be the most unsettling aspect of the case. After decades of investigation, the central question remains the same. What happened inside that house after the women arrived home? Most unsolved disappearances eventually produce a dominant theory. Investigators may disagree on details, but one explanation usually begins to fit the evidence better than the others. The Springfield Three case never reached that point. The reason becomes clear when the clues are viewed together. The women arrived home after 2 a.m. Their cars remained in the driveway. Their purses remained inside. Yet by morning, all 3 were gone. If they left voluntarily, why abandon essential belongings? If they were forced to leave, why was there so little evidence of a struggle? If someone gained access by force, why was there no clear sign of forced entry? Each clue seems to answer one question while creating another. That is what makes the case so difficult. The evidence points toward familiarity, urgency, and secrecy at the same time. For investigators, the most troubling detail may be the absence of a clear sequence. They cannot say with certainty who left first, whether the women left together, or what happened during the final moments inside the house. And that missing sequence changes everything. In many cases, detectives can build a chain of events. Here, the chain breaks at the exact point where the answers should begin. More than 30 years later, the Springfield Three investigation remains one of the most unusual disappearances in American criminal history, not because investigators found too many clues, but because the most important clue may be the one they never found. More than 30 years have passed since three women disappeared from a quiet home in Springfield, Missouri. During that time, investigators have followed leads, examined suspects, and reconstructed timelines. Yet the central mystery remains unresolved. The unusual nature of the case is not simply that the women vanished. It is that they vanished while leaving behind nearly everything that suggested they intended to stay. Investigators know where the women were that evening. They know when they likely arrived home. What they cannot determine is what happened after the front door closed behind them. That missing period of time has become the defining gap in the investigation. Somewhere within those unaccounted for hours lies the explanation for one of America's most enduring disappearance cases. The evidence points toward a visitor who may have been allowed inside, yet it never confirms who that person was. It suggests urgency, yet reveals almost no signs of chaos. It hints at planning, yet leaves behind a scene that appears strangely ordinary. For detectives, that combination is exceptionally rare. Most cases eventually narrow toward a single explanation. The Springfield Three case continues to resist that process. And perhaps that is why the case remains so compelling decades later. Every clue feels important, but no clue feels complete. The broken porch light, the unanswered phone calls, the cars in the driveway, the purses on the table. Each detail adds weight to the mystery, but none of them reveals what happened during the final hours. Today, the house is no longer the center of an active crime scene, but the questions attached to it have never disappeared. Investigators, journalists, and true crime researchers continue searching for the missing piece of the timeline. Because until that missing piece is found, the Springfield Three case remains suspended between multiple explanations, with no definitive answer strong enough to close the investigation. And after more than 3 decades, the most unsettling possibility is that the key to solving the case was present from the beginning, but hidden within a timeline investigators still cannot fully reconstruct. After years of investigation, detectives had collected hundreds of interviews, examined numerous leads, and evaluated multiple theories. Yet none of them fully explained every piece of evidence. Instead of searching for the most dramatic explanation, investigators focused on a simpler question: which theory best fit the known facts? One possibility was that the women opened the door to someone they knew. The lack of confirmed forced entry made this theory difficult to dismiss. A familiar visitor could have entered the home without creating immediate alarm. However, investigators have never publicly identified evidence proving that such a meeting took place. Another theory suggested that the women encountered danger only after leaving the house. But investigators faced the same problem again. Why would all three leave behind their purses, identification, and vehicles if they expected to travel anywhere? That unanswered question has remained one of the strongest arguments against a voluntary departure. Over the years, several individuals have been discussed publicly in connection with the case. Some attracted attention because of criminal histories, others because of statements they allegedly made. But despite extensive investigation, no suspect has been charged, and no publicly available evidence has been sufficient to solve the case. Perhaps the most important lesson investigators learned is that a mystery does not become easier simply because time passes. Memories fade, physical evidence deteriorates. Witnesses move away or die. Every year, without an answer, makes reconstruction more difficult. Yet the search continues, because someone, somewhere, may still hold the missing piece. More than 3 decades have passed since Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall disappeared from a quiet home in Springfield, Missouri. Investigators have followed thousands of leads, interviewed countless witnesses, and examined every major theory that could be supported by evidence. Yet despite all that work, one question has never been answered. What happened during those final hours inside the house? Cases like this remind us that an investigation is rarely limited by the number of questions. It is limited by the quality of the answers. Detectives cannot close a case with assumptions. Every conclusion must be supported by evidence that can withstand scrutiny. In the Springfield Three investigation, that standard has never been met. The disappearance of 3 women from a single home remains exceptionally rare. Whether the explanation involves someone they trusted, a carefully planned crime, or circumstances investigators never uncovered, the available evidence still leaves critical gaps. Those gaps are the reason the case remains open. For the families, the investigation has never been just a case file. It has been decades of uncertainty. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays came and went with an empty seat at the table. While public attention has risen and fallen over the years, the absence of answers has remained constant. The Springfield Three case has influenced investigators, journalists, and true crime researchers for one reason above all others. It demonstrates how even a seemingly ordinary scene can conceal an extraordinary mystery. There was no dramatic crime scene, no obvious trail, and no single piece of evidence that explained everything. If someone still knows what happened that night, they may also know the answer to the one question investigators have been trying to solve since June 1992. Until that answer is found, the timeline remains incomplete, and 3 families continue to wait for the truth. Some cases remain unsolved because investigators never find enough evidence. Others remain unsolved because the evidence tells more than one story. The Springfield Three belongs to the second category. Every clue matters. Every timeline matters. Every unanswered question matters. And until those pieces fit together, this investigation remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. At Patterns of Crime, we don't just tell crime stories. We examine the evidence, reconstruct the timeline, and separate verified facts from speculation. If you enjoy evidence-based investigations into real cases, consider subscribing for future documentaries. And after examining the timeline, the evidence, and the unanswered questions in this case, which explanation do you think best fits the known facts? And what detail do you believe investigators may have overlooked? Let us know in the comments.